Okay, so apologies for the delay. We're going to look at John Milton's Areopagitica today and his treatise of education. And so a brief diversion from our main course of study, which is to study his poetry. And with his poetry, as I've been trying to argue, the preparations of a man who sensed a vocation to be England's great poet from a very early age, and so commenced on a course of preparation for that undertaking. So he did not try to finish or write or even attempt an epic at the age of 21, unlike the Romantics. The Romantic poets, also emulating Milton in their young years, attempted to write epic poems. And I think particularly in poets like John Keats, as great as he was and gifted, he's not quite ready for such an epic undertaking to write a grand poem like that. And Milton was aware of this, and so rather than writing an epic, tried his hand at lesser genres, shorter, easier to master, but all as a means, I believe, to prepare himself for what he undertook only at the end of his life. I don't think he intended on taking that long, but there was this thing called the English Civil War that intervened and kept him from doing what he believed he had been called to do. And we're going to look now at, as I say, these two prose works, and they're going to be examples of his prose works in general. Many others are worthy of reading, and I've read some of them, but not all of them. But all of his, or at least almost all of his important prose works are written between 1641 and 1660. So this is the time of the struggle between king and parliament, and the period of the Commonwealth, and also the protectorate under Cromwell. Remember, Milton's born in 1608. So 1641, he is, how old is he? 33 years of age. And the body of work that constitutes his prose shows his passionate involvement in the issues of his day. So he's a politically involved. I said he left England, or left Italy rather, to return to England to be a part of the political movement of his day. And like so much of 17th century prose, its aim is immediate and it's practical. It may not seem so to us when we read it because it seems rather elaborate. It's stylish and Latinate in its structuring. But it engages with perennial questions, and this is what we're engaging with today in our first tract, Areopagitica. It's the issue of speech and freedom of speech. And these are, I think, amongst his prose works, the preeminent ones. And the matters about which they're concerned are ones that concern people to this very day. And you will have seen that and heard that the issues of free speech and of education are issues that are very much topical in our day. But he asserts, and let me just give you a little background to the two prose works before engaging with Areopagitica. In his work Pro Populo Anglicano Defensio Secunda, 1654, Milton asserts that his prose works of the 1640s, like these two that we're going to look at today, were written in accordance with a very orderly scheme for treating religious, domestic, and civil liberty. All of them. So here it's going to be civil liberty. He will deal with religious liberty when he talks about the discipline of divorce. He'll also talk about political liberty and domestic liberty and so forth. So a strong theme, undercurrent of liberty that he repeatedly engages with in his prose works while writing during the time of the Commonwealth and the Protectorate. And what we can note in these is a breadth of learning and of mind, and a generosity of spirit in many ways that I think makes him very appealing to this very day. He shows a great deal of judgment in his assessments of things. And there are, in many ways, the first work we're looking at, Areopagitica, is seen as the first defense of free speech. Later writers will cite this, and other writers might become more famous on this. John Stuart Mills on liberty and so forth in the 19th century. But this is the first foray into the field in the English-speaking world, and in some ways represents a very English preoccupation, which is the hatred of tyranny. Is very much part of the Anglo-Saxon spirit. Even going back to the Anglo-Saxon age, it's very much of an Anglo-Saxon thing that is not common in other nations. And Milton is well aware of that fact and is proud of that fact. And in our globalist day, when nations are, we don't want to present any sort of hierarchy of the different people groups or cultures and so forth, it's hard to assert that the British people, in its traditions and its expressions and its traditional understandings of itself, of its politics, etc., has always prized liberty. But it's really hard to dispute that it isn't so. You can see the flowering of that in the American Revolution as well. Exactly the same spirit of liberty and the resistance to tyranny that we see in Milton's work. There is a context for it, which I think is somewhat of interest. I don't get into Milton's life too much on this course, but there's some interest. In 1642, he marries a woman by the name of Mary Powell, who's the daughter of a royalist family. And the royalists are on the other side of the political debate. And that made their marriage rather incompatible, because Milton was nothing if not a Republican in his sensibilities. He was on the parliamentary side. So that political tension was not resolved in their marriage. And within 5 months, I think, or even a few months, Mary had to go back home to be with her family. She couldn't live with John. In the next year, Milton published a work called The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce. Yeah. I say this because this is going to make Milton, in amongst the Puritans, a rather controversial figure. Most Puritans are not in favor of divorce, and they will not support Milton's assertions on it. In fact, they may wish his work never saw the light of day. And so I say this as a lead up to Areopagitica, because they will have this in mind when they're reading Areopagitica. And this is a series of first in the series of 4 tracts in which he argues for a position which is, in his day, is astonishingly liberal. Especially when he argues that mental incompatibility is a valid basis for divorce. Mental incompatibility. In other words, Mary Powell is just simply not his intellectual equal. And it's not just equal, it is incompatible. Now, what that means exactly is, well, you can read the treatise there. But these are eras of divorce controversy, 1643 to 1645, around the same time Areopagitica is coming about. So when he writes these 2 works that we're going to look at in 1644, he's in the midst of the divorce controversy. So, and you might want to know, in 1645, Mary actually returns to her husband. And in the years that follow, she has 4 children with him. So, despite all of that, you can imagine what she's thinking. Her husband is publicly presenting a position in favor of divorce. He's separated from his wife, and yet she returns to him, and they have 4 children. His son John dies in his infancy, and 3 daughters survive, and they become instrumental in his later life because they become his amanuenses, his scribes. He educates them and they become his scribes. So later on, he will argue in favor of regicide in the work called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates in 1649. That's going to be after this period. And that work led to his appointment as the Secretary for Foreign Tongues to the Council of State. And that involved all sorts of things, including a work called Iconoclastes, which is a religious work that engaging in the opposition to icons and largely is seen as a response to Charles I. I think I can skip over that. His wife died, Mary. He married again to a woman by the name of Catherine Woodcock in 1656, and that ended 15 months later when she died after childbirth. Very sad. He married a third time to a woman by the name of Elizabeth Minshall, Minshul, and she outlived him. You might be happy to know. But after the death of Cromwell in 1658, Cromwell's government was leaning and tottering, and eventually it fell. And Milton wrote a work that is actually also worth reading, The Ready and Easy Way to Establish a Free Commonwealth, right before the restoration of Charles II. So again, this is a man not without his bravery. He writes about the free and easy way to establish a commonwealth right when Charles II is about to return to England. And as again, he's placed under house arrest, and many want him to be executed. And Andrew Marvell basically saves his head. The great poet, who was patronized by Lord Fairfax, who led the Republican armies against Charles I, but refused to have anything to do with the execution. So Fairfax had huge influence in the outcome there. So Marvell influences Fairfax, Fairfax influences Charles II, and Milton's life is spared. But he's placed under house arrest. He's blind. They say, what is he going to do? Well, what is he going to do? He's going to write the three great poems. So this first work that we're going to look at, Areopagitica, is fascinating because, again, and it speaks to the courage of the man as much as anything, was written specifically as a protest against a parliamentary order. The parliamentary order's date is June 14th, 1643, and it states that no book, no pamphlet, no paper can be printed without a license from the proper authorities. And so what does Milton do? Publishes Areopagitica. So it's a document writing in favor of unlicensed printing that goes against an already existing parliamentary decree. So he's running the risk, of course, of the wrath of Parliament. Now, the Parliament whose wrath he risks running afoul of are people that are on his side from a religious and a political vantage point. But still, he's testing their law right away. And it moves from that particular occasion to become a definitive defense of the idea of free speech. Milton does this throughout his life. He seizes upon events. We'll find the same thing when he writes the poem Lycidas. The event is the drowning of a friend, and he decides to use that occasion to write a pastoral elegy. So the specific events, he is responding to them, but then because of the breadth of his learning, he recognizes the larger significance of individual tragedies or individual political events that bring us into a larger context. So he is what we would call a public intellectual in that sense. He's the first and the best example of a public intellectual, to my mind. He will frame it in a larger, he'll pull it out of the heat of politics. Politics is always a heated enterprise, as we know right now, south of the border. There's a lot of heat coming out of that, political affairs, especially with the transition to a new regime. And there's a great deal of, it's difficult to get any sense of perspective. Milton frames things in a larger sense and tries to help people see what they're doing and maybe rethink it. The form of it is a classical oration, and it has a certain dignity of style, which sometimes can lead us to overlook the irony in some of his points, which is at times pretty savage, actually. But because the oration is soaring, just like in Paradise Lost, we can miss the subtler aspect. So in Paradise Lost, book 4, the interactions between Adam and Eve, they're actually extremely funny. It's domestic comedy. But because he's writing in the grand style of the epic, we think that the matter is up here and it's never down at the level of comedy, but it is. I think you can see that. But again, the style to some degree can trick us there. But he is most particularly convicted of something that I'm personally convicted about, and actually he led me to be convicted about when I read this in third year university, when I did 17th century literature, of the individual nature of the search for truth and the conviction that the knowledge of evil is a necessary condition for the knowledge of good. In other words, the fall furthered God's purposes. He did not want the fall to happen, and yet good came out of evil. So the conviction that knowledge of evil is a necessary condition for the knowledge of good, and this work stands alongside Paradise Lost as one of the central convictions of Western culture on this subject matter. Evil is evil. It is in no way to be seen as a form of the good, and yet it is necessary for us to truly understand what goodness is. While at the same time, when we come to Paradise Lost, we'll see that his depiction of evil is a classical orthodox one. It's the absence of good. It's the one of Boethius, it's the one of Augustine. Evil is the privatio boni, the privation of the good. All the same, Milton is going to argue that the understanding, the expression of evil helps us to understand the good. And so in that sense, there's some goodness that came even from original sin. Not in the sin itself, but in after the fact in terms of education. I'll get further to that. And it is I would say it's a doctrine in the grand tradition of Christian humanism, which also informs of education, which is a work which is much less eloquent. Of education is relatively mundane in its rhetoric. It seems a little tedious comparatively to this, although its interest is powerful. So the title, let me say something about the title. May be obvious, but I'll say it because it is a lecture on it and I should not avoid the obvious. Published November 23rd, 1644. At the height of the English Civil War, as I said, the divorce controversy, I framed it already in the light of that. It takes its title in part from the Areopagiticos. I won't even bother writing it in Greek, which was originally, Christians will know it from Acts 17, but it is an address by the famous Athenian orator Isocrates. Areopagitica, obviously. Pagitica. And the Areo is Ares, in other words, Mars, and the Pagos is the hill. So it's the Mars Hill address, and this is the a hill in Athens, which is the site of legendary tribunals, where the Supreme Court of Athens met. Hence the image in the background of justice, the blindfolded justice there, and so forth. So it is meant to deal with the issue of justice as well. At least the Areopagos is. That's where the Supreme Court of Athens meets. And Isocrates delivers his address, that is the Athenian orator, and Milton is alluding to that in his text, and probably assumes that his audience has read that particular text as well. And some argue, and I think I'm going to want to throw my lot in with them and agree with this, that Milton is probably referring more specifically to the importance of addressing the very thing that Paul does in Acts 17, namely the charges of promulgating foreign gods and strange teachings. So if you want to look at Acts 17, 18 to 34, maybe I could throw it up here if we want to. Acts 17, and that should work. Then some certain if you've seen this many times if you're in Dr. Davis's class, doubtless. Then some certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, that is Paul, and some said, "What will this babbler say?" Others some, "He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. He's disgusted. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, nor is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitations, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him, and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Quoting the tragic poet. As certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone graven by art and man's device. And the times of this ignorance God winked at is that he turned a blind eye to, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, We will hear thee again of this matter. And so Paul departed from them. Howbeit, certain men clave unto him and believed, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So he preached with effect. So that's the context for Milton's Areopagitica as well, I think, is the issue of false teaching, which Paul explicitly addresses in the Mars Hill Address. because the Parliament, which is dominated by the Presbyterians in the parliamentarian fold, want to prevent falsehood from creeping into the minds of the people of their nation. And to prevent that, are wanting to get a approval process whereby they have to approve it before any of the public see it. Regarding themselves to be rigorous in their doctrine and clear-sighted in their thinking, they want approval before they should publish anything. I had that here at Tyndale. When I wrote on the sex ed curriculum, there was a big kerfuffle in-house, and they said, I was asked going forward if I would submit the articles to the office before I published the next thing, and so I put something on the requisite desk after I published the next one. I'm just following Milton's footsteps on this. Free speech means nothing if you won't stand for it. It was a good thing to do. It was fun. You got to stand for the truth if you believe that truth has power. That's Milton. That's Milton's position. It's small courage on my part. On his part, the consequences of flouting or criticizing the religious authorities were not death, but flogging, public flogging, cutting off of ears, cuts on the cheeks. And this, in fact, is what incited Milton to write that very thing. One of his, I'm not sure his friends, but somebody with whom he had sufficient ground to support this was going on. And Milton thought, if this is going on and others are suffering under the Parliament whose side they are on, then this has to stop right now. And so the 1643, and here's the direct name of it, the Ordinance for the Regulating of Printing, or known as the Licensing Order, required them to have a license in order to print anything or publish anything. Milton will argue, among other things, this is exactly what, and now he's speaking to his audience, this is exactly what the Catholics have done in the Inquisition. They required, they have an index of banned books. Do you want to be like the King Charles, who you regard as guilty of popery? Do you want to do the exact same thing as he? I know that you are doctrinally different than he, but the practice you abhor. And the persecution that ensued. Are you not doing the same thing? So in 1638, there was a political agitator. His name was John Lilburne. He was arrested for importing subversive books, fined $500, publicly flogged for 2 miles while he's walking along between the prison, Fleet Prison, and the pillory where he would be tied up. The post. And then Milton writes this pamphlet as a protest against that. So again, if you're writing and you've seen the consequence, you know what you're risking. That's bravery. And he himself was censored in some of his own publications, but he had not been flogged. Because again, he's one of the great friends of the parliamentary cause, writing on their behalf, etc. But when he writes the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, and he does it anonymously, wisely, and it's unpublished, or rather it's unlicensed, the Puritan clergy of his day condemn it. Whoever wrote this hideous tract, inspired by Satan, etc. If we find that man, and of course, and would have been argued at the point, was promoting sexual libertinism. Yes. Well, sedition would be against the crown. The crown, Charles I is still. Yes, that's in 1649. This is okay. That's 5 years down the road, or 6 years down the road. At this point, the Parliament has a strong majority of Puritans in it, and Charles responds to the parliamentary refusal to give him what he wants by basically proroguing the Parliament for 6 years. In other words, there's no political involvement aside from and so this is the back and forth between them. But sedition with the sovereign of the day is Charles I. It's Parliament that's issued this decree, and so to some degree, his liberal stance on this is at odds with Parliament. It's probably against Charles, but it would be perceived to be against Parliament, and Charles is probably very happy to have divisions in the ranks of his opponents. So maybe that saves his bacon as well. I don't know, but there's some complexity here, is what I'm suggesting with that. He wrote it for what was at that time a very engaged public. People are reading pamphlets ever since the Reformation, which I think took on legs, not just because Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg, but because people took the 95 Theses off the door of Wittenberg and went and copied it and distributed it everywhere. And people were reading it. They didn't go to the Wittenberg door and read what he put on the door. Somebody else grabbed it, took it down, printed it out in huge numbers, and it was being read widely. So the printing press is the context, the ability to have debates that way transcend the usual limited confines of the academy, in the way that in our day we see that the internet is doing. So it's breaking the traditional media monopoly and licensing of who gets to speak or what. So any fool can publish their views on the internet now, pretty much. There's been some pushback in recent years, restraint, whatever, but this is the back and forth on this. So when Milton publishes this anonymously, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be widely read, and it is great. It's creating a great deal of controversy. The clergy, of course, are going to be up in arms about it, and it's chock full of biblical and classical references, and he uses both of them to buttress his argument, and this is again characteristic of Milton, and it involves something of the issue of Christ and culture that I'm going to want to talk about. I'll say more about that when I talk about of education, actually, and his particular angle on that, because I'm going to argue next, discussing of education, that Milton is recommending what we would call a classical education. But a Protestant classical education is not the same thing as a Catholic classical education. There are differences, and you might not see that because they're reading the same sort of texts. And I'll say more about that when we come to it. But he's addressing largely the Calvinist Presbyterians in Parliament. And he's appealing to the public on this. When I say the public, it's not the common man, although there could be some common man. It's the educated. Remember, the Reformation is back in 1517. We are now in over 100 years on. Literacy has become much more widespread than it was in the 16th century. We now have people who are able to read the Bible in their own language and have become literate as a consequence, and have been able to read other books in English as a consequence. And that has spread also the teaching of the Reformation and dispersed it into the families all around England. So it's a very different context than it was when the Reformation began. You have a much better educated populace, and the arguments that have been used by the educated have filtered down in not just their theology, but their politics and their social theories, their ethics, whatever, have become the discussion at dinner tables. And so when he writes this, he presumes an engaged public. whose basic principle is the right and also the duty as a rational being to take responsibility for his own beliefs and actions. The individual, not the king's responsibility. We saw that last time when we looked at Comus Amask. It's not the example, the moral example is not that of the queen or the nobility. The moral example lies in your household. You don't need an example that you can't aspire to yourself or embody in your own person. So it's a democratization of nobility, if you will, or a downloading of aristocracy, with the idea that every Englishman's home is his castle, and that he's the king, as it were, over his household. That's in his sphere of authority. And again, the tyranny is in having higher magistrates usurp the responsibility of lower magistrates. So there's very much of a bottom-up approach to life that's a consequence of the Reformation, or at least the Reformation's interpretation of Scripture's mandate to be educated and to take responsibility. It's not just for your king or your sovereign to have religious sensibilities and to make sure you follow him. You are responsible for your own soul. You need to act in accordance with that. Therefore, you need to understand these issues. That sensibility, I think, is with us to this day. There's a lot of irresponsibility in the populace. You can tell that on, by whom they vote and the basis that they choose to decide to vote upon, which is largely buying their votes. But nonetheless, it's not wholly lost. There's a sense of the politicians are responsible to us, because I'm ultimately, in a I think a vulgar way, I pay for your salary. It's more to the point, I have a God-given responsibility that I'm going to delegate to you to give you the time to represent me here. And you are accountable to me because I'm accountable to God, and we're going to hold one another accountable here. That's the spirit. Anyway, so to go on to Areopagitica without yammering on further here. So it's a speech of John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England. And from Euripides, he quotes, "This is true liberty, when free-born men, having to advise the public, may speak free, which he who can and will deserves high praise. Who neither can nor will may hold his peace. What can be juster in a state than this?" So then he begins. And I'm going to read some extracts and then I'll comment. Some of the passages in this are so famous that they exist on their own as memes, more or less, before that word even existed. There were famous quotations from Areopagitica because he has a gift for a turn of phrase that I think you will recognize here. But let me read some of this. I'll put it in front of me, but I'm going to read my actual book. "They who to states and governors of the Commonwealth direct their speech, High Court of Parliament." Now again, he calls them the High Court, just again like the High Court of Athens. "High Court of Parliament, or wanting such access in a private condition, write that which they foresee may advance the public good. I suppose them, as at the beginning of no mean endeavor, not a little altered and moved inwardly in their minds, some with doubt of what will be the success, others with fear of what will be the censure, some with hope, others with confidence of that which they have to speak. And me, perhaps each of these dispositions, as the subject was whereon I entered, may have at other times variously affected, and likely might in these foremost expressions now also disclose which of them swayed most. But that the very attempt of this address thus made, and the thought of whom it hath recourse to, hath got the power within me to a passion far more welcome than incidental to a preface. Which though I stay not to confess ere any ask, I shall be blameless, if it be no other than the joy and gratulation which it brings to all who wish and promote their country's liberty. Whereof this whole discourse proposed will be a certain testimony, if not a trophy. For this is not the liberty which we can hope, that no grievance ever should arise in the Commonwealth. That let no man in this world expect. But when complaints are freely heard, deeply considered, and speedily reformed, then is the utmost bound of civil liberty attained that wise men look for. To which, if I now manifest by the very sound of this which I shall utter, that we are already in good part arrived, and yet from such a steep disadvantage of tyranny and superstition, grounded into our principles as was beyond the manhood of a Roman recovery, it will be attributed first, as it is most due, to the strong assistance of God our deliverer. Next, to your faithful guidance and undaunted wisdom, lords and commons of England. Neither is it in God's esteem the diminution of his glory when honorable things are spoken of good men and worthy magistrates, which if I now first should begin to do, after so fair a progress of your laudable deeds, and such a long obligement upon the whole realm to your indefatigable virtues, I might be justly reckoned among the tardiest, and the unwillingness of them that praise ye. Nevertheless, there being three principal things, without which all praising is but courtship and flattery. First, mark it in your text if you have it. First, when that only is praised which is solidly worth praise. Next, when greatest likelihoods are brought that such things are truly and really in those persons to whom they are ascribed. The other, when he who praises, by showing that such his actual persuasion is, whom he writes, can demonstrate that he flatters not. The former two of these I have heretofore endeavored, rescuing the employment from him who went about to impair your merits with a trivial and malignant encomium, that is a praise of speech. The latter is belonging chiefly to mine own acquittal. That whom I so extolled I did not flatter hath been reserved opportunely to this occasion. For he who freely magnifies what hath been nobly done, and fears not to declare as freely what might be done better, gives ye the best covenant of his fidelity, and that his loyalest affection and his hope waits on your proceedings. In other words, you've done a good thing here. Your intentions are good, and I'm going to propose something better. It's in that spirit. It's not you're wrong. It's that you're not quite right. You've done a good thing because you desire good things because of your virtue, etc. But there's a better course. His highest praising is not flattery, and his plainest advice is a kind of praising. For though I should affirm and hold by argument that it would be far better with truth, it would fare better with truth, with learning and the Commonwealth, if one of your published orders, which I should name, were called in, yet at the same time it could not but much redound to the luster of your mild and equal government, when as private persons are hereby animated to think ye better pleased with public advice than other statists have been delighted heretofore with public flattery. So, because of your republican virtues, you will welcome public input in a way that no state hitherto has done since Greek times. The Romans aspired to this and failed to hold on to the republic. We now have the hope of they're moving towards republican government. They want shared responsibility with the monarch. They've not yet seized it, but they're moving in that direction. And in the spirit of that, let's advance a better course, once again, as I say. And men will then see what difference there is between the magnanimity of a triennial parliament and that jealous haughtiness of prelates and cabin counselors that usurped of late, whenas they shall observe ye in the midst of your victories and successes more gently brooking written exceptions against a voted order than other courts, which had produced nothing worth memory but the weak ostentation of wealth, would have endured the least signified dislike at any proclamation. So what you're going to do is you're going to be able to demonstrate the superiority of your rule to that of the monarch, who brooks no opposition. When you don't do what he says, he disbands you, won't tolerate anything. Do you want to be like him? Are you gonna? Is your tolerance for dissent as extreme? You can differentiate yourself in your actions right here. If I should thus far presume, so the Triennial Parliament, Parliaments Act 1641 stipulated the automatic issue of writs for a new parliament if the king failed to summon one within 3 years of the closing of the previous. And out of, I might find myself, if any should accuse me of being new or insolent, did they know but how much better I find ye esteem it to imitate the old and elegant humanity of Greece than the barbaric pride of Hunnish in Norwegian state lines. Yeah, political correctness you're not going to find in this text. And out of those ages, to whose polite wisdom and letters we owe that we are not yet Goths and Jutlanders, I could name him, Isocrates. I could name him who from his private house wrote that discourse to the Parliament of Athens, which he's now emulating from his private house. I'm following the example of the great orator of Athens, Isocrates. That persuades them to change the form of democracy which was then established. Such honor was done in those days to men who professed the study of wisdom and eloquence, not only in their own country, but in other lands, that cities and signories heard them gladly and with great respect, if they had aught in public to admonish the state. Thus did Dion Prusias, a stranger and a private order, counsel the Rhodians against a former edict. And I abound with other like examples, which to set here would be superfluous. But if from the industry of life, wholly dedicated to studious labors, and those natural endowments, happily not the worse for 52 degrees of northern latitude, so much must be derogated as to count me not equal to any of those who had this privilege. I would obtain to be thought not so inferior as yourselves are superior to the most of them who receive their counsel. So I'm not that much below Socrates because you're superior to Isocrates' audience. So is he praising them? Yes, he is. Is he flattering them? No, I think he believes what he says because they're Christians. They have a knowledge of what liberty is and what truth is. They know who God is. They're not those who worship an unknown God like the Athenians in Acts 17. Spirit of those, and how far you excel them, be assured, lords and commons, there can be no greater testimony appear than when your prudent spirit acknowledges and obeys the voice of reason, from what quarter soever it be heard speaking, and renders ye as willing to repeal any act of your own setting forth as any set forth by your predecessors. So there's the framing of it at the end. It's a noble act to recant of your own act and allow a liberty there that you did not initially perceive. This is the effect of Isocrates' speech, was to change the mind of the Athenians on the issue of liberty. If ye be thus resolved, as it were injury to think ye were not, I know not that should withhold me from presenting you with fit instance wherein to show both that love of truth, which ye eminently profess, and that uprightness of your judgment, which is not wont to be partial to yourselves. But judging over again that order which ye have ordained to regulate printing, and now he quotes their own words back at them, that no book, pamphlet, or paper shall be henceforth printed, unless the same be first approved and licensed by such, or at least one of such as shall be thereto appointed. For that part which preserves justly every man's copy to himself, or provides for the poor, I touch not. Only wish they would not be made pretenses to abuse and persecute on honest and painful men, that is, careful, painstaking men, who offend not in either of these particulars. But that other clause, now he's going to give 3 arguments here, but that other clause of licensing books, which we thought had died with his brother, quadragesmal and matrimonial, when the prelates expired, I shall now attend with such a homily, because he's going to appeal. Censorship existed under Charles I, and he executed it through the Star Chamber, which was a judiciary body that basically persecuted Charles I's enemies. It was a private judicial branch that was much reviled by the Puritans because Charles used it to persecute his enemies. The Star Chamber had no ability to execute people, but it could destroy them, make their lives miserable, ruin them financially. That's what Charles I did to his opponents. So he used legal means that were not publicly accountable and got people to confess things. So he's acting a bit like an inquisitor. Spanish Inquisition. We thought that these had expired, but now we see that they've been picked up again. I shall now attend with such a homily as shall lay before ye, first the inventors of it, to be those whom ye will be loath to own. Next, so I'm going to show you, you don't want to be associated with the sort of legislation that you've just passed. I'm going to talk about all those who the bad examples that you've thrown yourselves in with unwittingly, or not sufficient cognizance because you've produced this decree. Secondly, next, what is to be thought in general or reading, whatever sort the books be, and that this order avails nothing to the suppressing of scandalous, seditious, and libelous books. So in other words, it's useless what you're doing. It puts you in bad company. Second, what you're trying to do won't work, which were mainly intended to be suppressed, that is the libelous books. And then last, that it will be primely to the discouragement of all learning. This is the flourish. This is his biggest. He saves his biggest argument to last. That this will be primely, principally, if you will, to the discouragement of all learning, and the stop of truth, not only by disexercising and blunting our abilities in what we know already, but by hindering and cropping the discovery that might yet further be made in religious and civil wisdom. So these are his 3 arguments. One, that you will not want to be connected with the sorts of people that suppress things. Secondly, that the scandalous, seditious, and libelous books will fail to be suppressed. And finally, the unintended consequences that all learning will be blunted, and truth with it, and liberty destroyed in the process. Because liberty depends on truth and freedom. It's a powerful argument, and he concludes with it as this is the killer point, and he will get to that. And then comes to the famous, that is just the preamble, not the famous speech, but he's just laid out what he's going to do. So the 3 parts, he's going to talk about the bad company that people that write these are in. Then he's going to argue how useless the attempt to suppress free speech will be, or suppress sedition and suppress libel. But it will have the unwitting consequence of doing the very thing that it most would wish to avoid. It's going to harm the truth. It's not going to suppress the falsehood, but it's going to harm the truth. So don't do it for that reason. Strong arguments. So I deny not that it is of the greatest concernment in the church and commonwealth to have a vigilant eye how books demean themselves as well as men, and thereafter to confine, imprison, and do sharpest justice on them as malefactors. So he has no problem with, by the way, with destroying books after they've been published and have been read. And you can discern the falsehood. If they're libelous, seditious, slanderous, whatever, at that point you can do that with them. So he's not opposed to censoring falsehood after it's been published. It's allowing false teaching. We're not going to allow false teaching, but it's requiring it in advance that it has to be approved before. That's what he opposes. If I've written something wrong, tell me what's wrong, point it out, and then allow no one else to read it, by all means. But don't do it in advance of the publication. That's the whole meat of the argument. He says, they do sharp us as malefactors, for books are not absolutely dead things. Famous quote. But do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. They do preserve, as in a vial, the purest efficacy and extraction of that living intellect that bred them. I know they are as lively and as vigorously productive as those fabulous dragon's teeth, and being sown up and down may chance to spring up armed men. Reference to Ovid's Metamorphoses. Jason and Medea. And yet, on the other hand, unless wariness be used, as good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Note that he qualifies it. It's a good book. He doesn't say who kills a book. He kills a good book. Many a man lives a burden to the earth, but a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. 'Tis true, no age can restore a life, whereof perhaps there is no great loss, and revolutions of ages do not oft recover the loss of a rejected truth, for the want of which whole nations fare the worse. We should be wary, therefore, what persecution we raise against the living labors of public men, how we spill that seasoned life of man, preserved and stored up in books. Since we see a kind of homicide may thus be committed. Sometimes a martyrdom, and if it extended the whole impression, a kind of massacre, whereof the execution ends not in the slaying of an elemental life, but strikes at that ethereal and fifth essence, the breath of reason itself, slays an immortality rather than a life. But lest I should be condemned of introducing license, while I oppose licensing, I refuse not the pains to be so much historical as will serve to show what hath been done by ancient and famous commonwealths against this disorder, till the very time that this project of licensing crept out of the Inquisition, was catched up by our prelates. When he refers to the prelates, he's talking about the Anglican clergy. Remember, Henry VIII has made the English church under the rule of the king. And the prelates that he refers to are therefore the Anglican clergy. And they're censuring their religious opponents, namely the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Anabaptists, everyone who's not. It's not just against the Catholics, it's against any Protestant that is in agreement with the Anglican Church, and has led to this parliament who is representing the voice of the religious who are opposed to the tyranny of the Anglicans as much as they were opposed to the tyranny of the Catholics. And hath caught some of our presbyters. By the way, the Anglicans have no love for John Milton. For this reason, as you can imagine. So the great Samuel Johnson despises Milton. Does not like his politics, does not like his writing even, which I always found rather extraordinary. But I guess you can't excise Milton's political views from his poetics. It's just they're too interwoven to do that. So now he's going to go to historical precedent, and the historical precedents are carefully chosen, and they all are related to republics, of which the parliamentarians would fain profess to be, would desire to be, even though at the moment they're under a monarchy. They are moving towards a republican, at least that type of government. They want shared power. They're not committed to throwing out the king. They want some sort of collaboration. The king claims his divine right, and he will not share power. He will even disband Parliament, and for which reason the Civil War eventually breaks out. By the way, during the Civil War, they capture the king a few times. The king agrees to grant them certain privileges. Once he's released from arrest, he goes back to what he did before and recants on his word. After he does it a few times, they say this man cannot be trusted. He's a tyrant. He is unreformable, and we will execute him as the last resort. So it's a process. It's not just let's go get him and hunt him down. It's not like in what happened in France. There was a process, a slow process. But back to the precedent. I don't want to spend too much time on this because the gist of the arguments there. I want to come to some of the highlights of the prose. But the threefold arguments. One, the precedent for censorship puts you on the wrong side of history, to use a contemporary phrase. You really don't want to be associated with the censors. And you, although you represent truth and liberty, have managed to put yourself on the wrong side here, and you can change that. So first of all, in Athens, where books and wits were ever busier than in any other part of Greece, I find but only two sorts of writings which the magistrate cared to take notice of. Those either blasphemous and atheistical, or libelous. Thus the books of Protagoras were by the judges of Areopagus commanded to be burnt. Protagoras, famous disquisition about gods, the man about whom it is said declared that man is the measure of all things, were judged by the judges of Areopagus, condemned to burn, and himself banished the territory for a discourse begun with his confessing not to know, quote, whether there were gods or whether not. Sufficient. They banished him. And against defaming, it was agreed that none should be traduced by name, as was the manner of Vetus Commodia, whereby we may guess how they censured libeling. And this course was quick enough, as Cicero writes to, the famous Latin orator, Roman orator, to quell both the desperate wits of other atheists and the open way of defaming, as the event showed. Of other sects and opinions, though tending to voluptuousness and the denying of divine providence, they took no heed. They just, as they blinked, winked, turned a blind eye. Therefore, we do not read that either Epicurus or the libertine school of Cyrene or what the Cynic impudence uttered was ever questioned by the laws. So the Stoics, the Cynics, the Epicureans were allowed to write and speak. So there was considerable liberty there, because from the vantage point of most people, these are recommending entirely libertine philosophies. And yet the Athenians allowed it. Therefore, neither is it recorded that the writings of those old comedians were suppressed, though the acting of them were forbid. And that Plato commended the reading of Aristophanes, the loosest of them all, to his royal scholar Dionysius, is commonly known, and may be excused by the way Aristophanes puts Socrates in his plays. Humiliates him, does scandalous things to Socrates, like the princes of his days. I mean, it's really bad. Plato recommends that to Dionysius to read, despite not agreeing with the language, the practice, whatever. You read Plato's writing, he does not commend what Aristophanes does. So he's clearly allowing him to read things that he is in strong disagreement with, because they're well written and allow the ruler to discern the falsehood and the truth well presented by an opponent and so forth. So that's part of the justification. And this is what is Milton, he's going to lead up to this. In order for truth to burn the brightest, it requires the falsehood in open combat to be defeated. It requires it. Doesn't mean that you can print it, because there are consequences to the printing of it. And you can't do libel, you can't do sedition, you can't promote atheism, but there is latitude for immorality to be presented in writing for us to deal with without recommending the practice. And if Holy Chrysostom, as is reported, nightly studied so much the same author, and had the art to cleanse a scurrilous vehemence into the style of a rousing sermon. So Chrysostom, the famous church father, Bishop of Constantinople, read Aristophanes as well for his style, cleansed himself of all the vulgarity and so forth. The other leading city of Greece, Lacedaemon, Sparta, considered the Lycurgus, that Lycurgus, their lawgiver, was so addicted to elegant learning as to have been the first that brought out of Ionia the scattered works of Homer, and sent Thales from Crete to prepare and mollify the Spartan surliness with his smooth songs and odes, the better to plan among them law and civility. It is to be wondered how museless and unbookish they were, minding naught but the feats of war. Spartans were famous for their contempt for these things, and yet their foremost politician, Lycurgus, read the same works and sent Thales, who is the most famous and the first of the pre-Socratic philosophers, to bring more back to Sparta. So there's a type of learning which even the natural temperament of the Spartans opposed, that their ruler recognized was necessary for the good of his own people, to make them better and more just people. There was no licensing of books among them, for they disliked all but their own Iaconic apothegms, and took a slight occasion to chase Archilochus out of their city, perhaps for composing in a higher strain than their own soldierly ballads and roundels could reach to. Or if it were for his broad verses, they were not therein so cautious, but they were as dissolute in their promiscuous conversing, whence Euripides affirms in Andromache that their women were all unchaste. Thus much may give us light after what sort of books were prohibited among the Greeks. And then he goes on to the Romans. Do the same thing, and I'm going to skip over that. But the Roman example. But he will then go on to give the Roman example, and then he'll move on to the Christian example. And that's what he's going to characteristically do. He'll handle the Greeks, then he'll handle the Romans, and then he'll look at what Christians did with it. I'll conclude the bit before he gets to the Christians, the summary of the Romans, with this. From hence, this is the summary of the Roman, from hence we shall meet with little else but tyranny in the Roman Empire, and that we may not marvel, if not so often bad, as good books were silenced. I shall therefore deem to have been large enough in producing what among the ancients was punishable to write, save only which all other arguments were free to treat on. By this time the emperors were become Christians, whose discipline in this point I do not find to have been more severe than what was formerly in practice. So if you want to go to the primitive church as your example, which everyone in the Reformation is minded to do, they're worried about over the course of time, the gradual alteration of Christian truth away from its original pure state, and let's go back to the state of the early church. They chiefly will recommend Augustine. I'll say more about why Augustine and not others, but Augustine is the favored theologian of the Reformers. One of the church fathers, one among many, but he's the one that they most often cite. And I'll explain why that is briefly. But he says, by the time the emperors were become Christians, whose discipline in this point I do not find have been more severe than what was formerly in practice. So they didn't become more restrictive because of their piety, because of their holiness. They were more or less running along the same lines. The books of those whom they took to be great grand heretics were examined, refuted, and condemned in the general councils, and not till then were prohibited. So after a church council, the heresies were, when they were condemned as such, at that point they may not be read. So it's not just one political ruler, but as a general church council, are we in agreement that Arius is a heretic? Yes, then we will no longer allow the works of Arius to be read in Christian contexts. As for the writings of heathen authors, unless they were plain invectives against Christianity, as those of Porphyrius and Proclus, they met with no interdict that can be cited till about the year 400 in a Carthaginian council wherein bishops themselves were forbid to read the books of Gentiles, but heresies they might read, while others, long before them, on the contrary, scrupled more the books of heretics than of Gentiles. And that the primitive councils and bishops were wont only to declare what books were not commendable, passing no further, but leaving it to each man one's conscience to read or to lay by, till after the year 800 is observed already by Padre Paolo, Friar Paolo of Venice, who writes a history of the Council of Trent in the 15th century. The great unmasker of the Trentine Council, after which time the popes of Rome, engrossing what they pleased of political rule into their own hands, extended their dominion over man's eyes, as they had before over their judgments, burning and prohibiting to be read what they fancied not, yet sparing in their censures, and the books not many which they so dealt with, till Martin V, by his bull, not only prohibited, but was the first that excommunicated the reading of heretical books. You even read it, you're out. You are no longer a Christian. You're out of the church altogether. So it takes a step further. Not only is the book banished, but anyone who reads it is banished. For about that time, Wycliffe and Hus, Jan Hus, growing terrible, were they who first drove the papal court to a stricter policy of prohibiting, which course Leo X and his successors followed until the Council of Trent and the Spanish Inquisition engendering together brought forth or perfected those catalogues and expurging indexes of banned books that rake through the entrails of many an old good author with a violation worse than any could be offered to his tomb. Nor did they stay in matters heretical, but any subject that was not to their palate they either condemned in a prohibition or had it straight into the new purgatory of an index. He uses the word purgatory here. He doesn't believe in a purgatory, of course. So it's meant to be rather tongue-in-cheek amusing. To fill up the measure of encroachment, their last invention was to ordain that no book, pamphlet, or paper should be printed, as if St. Peter had bequeathed them the keys of the press, also out of paradise. Mock. I mean, keys of the church. Now they have the keys of the printing press. Unless it were, and of course he's again speaking to his audience. They're very happy with this language. Unless it were approved and licensed under the hands of 2 or 3 glutton friars, for example. And then he goes on to prove this. And then talks about the approval process. And he cites, and he does what anybody these days would be recommended to do in a public document. He cites his sources, quotes them directly, puts them in his text. I'm not misrepresenting them. Here's what they have said. So he goes then through the bad example of the Catholic Church, which of course is most in their eyes, and from the most anti-Christian council and the most tyrannous inquisition that ever inquired. Till then, books were ever as freely admitted into the world as any other birth. The issue of the brain was no more stifled than the issue of the womb. No envious Juno sat cross-legged over the nativity of any man's intellectual offspring. But if it proved a monster, who denies but that it was justly burnt or sunk into the sea? But that a book in worse condition than a peccant soul should be to stand before a jury ere it be born to the world, as akin to an abortion? and undergo yet in darkness the judgment of Radamanth and his colleagues, ere it can be past the ferry backward into light, was never heard before, till that mysterious iniquity provoked and troubled at the first entrance of Reformation, sought out new limbos and new hells, wherein they might include our books also within the number of their damned. So at the conclusion of this Inquisition, it's the reformers' books themselves that were placed under this interdiction and were prohibited from being read. And anyone who read them was considered a heretic and could be killed for reading the book as a consequence, right? It goes beyond simply, we're not going to read the books. If you possess the book. So, but some will say, what though the inventors were bad, the thing for all that may be good. It may be so. So he's made the argument. It was badly used here, but maybe the measure nonetheless could be good. So it's an entirely rational argument that he goes back and forth, and he does it in a very, I would say, measured, sourced, and tightly argued fashion with grand rhetorical flourishes at that. And he will then cite various examples here. But some will say, as I just said, what though the inventors were bad, the thing may be good. And he will admit to this, but then go on to say this. But I have to finish, as was propounded, what it ought to be thought in general of reading books, whatever sort they be, and whether they be more the benefit or the harm that thence proceeds. Not to insist upon the examples of Moses, Daniel, and Paul, but he is going to go there. He'll cite a biblical example first, who were skillful in all the learning of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Greeks, which could not probably be without reading their books of all sorts. In Paul especially, who thought it no defilement to insert into Holy Scripture the sentences of 3 Greek poets, and one of them a tragedian. The question was notwithstanding sometimes controverted among the primitive doctors, but with great odds on that side which affirmed it both lawful and profitable, as was then evidently perceived when Julian the Apostate, and subtlest enemy to our faith, made a decree forbidding Christians the study of heathen learning. Who banished and prohibited the study of heathen learning? Julian the Apostate. Extraordinary. It's a killer point. The first, it was the apostate that wanted it banished. For, said he, they wound us with their own weapons, and with our own arts and sciences they overcome us. And indeed the Christians were put so to their shifts by this crafty means, and so much in danger to decline into all ignorance, and that the two Apollinari were fain, as a man may say, to coin all the 7 liberal sciences out of the Bible, reducing it into diverse forms of orations, poems, dialogues, or even to the calculating of a new Christian grammar. So it was so pronounced under the Julian the Apostate that they called the 7 liberal arts heathen forms of learning, and will come up with a more Christian, biblical form. Now, this is really interesting. Milton is defending the pagan clarification, or the pagan identification here, as amenable with Christianity, but the more biblical angle, which was argued by Julian the Apostate, argued against it and claimed to be more biblical. And he was therefore seduced his contemporaries of influence to follow his example by being more biblical as well. Very interesting in the light of our day and the tendency, again, not to read great books, even amongst Christians. But with the historian Socrates, the providence of God provided a better way. Where is this? Jerome, I'll just pick it up here. But if it be agreed we shall be tried by visions, there is a vision recorded by Eusebius far ancienter than this tale of Jerome to the nun Eustochium, and besides has nothing of a fervor in it. Dionysius Alexandrinus, in about the year 240, a person of great name in the church for piety and learning, who had wont to avail himself much against heretics by being conversant in their books. until a certain presbyter laid it scrupulously to his conscience how he durst venture himself among those defiling volumes. The worthy man, loath to give offense, fell into a new debate with himself. What was to be thought, when suddenly a vision sent from God, it is his own epistle that so avers it, confirmed him in these words: read any books, whatever come to thy hands, for thou art sufficient both to judge aright and to examine each matter. To this revelation he assented the sooner, as he confesses, because it was answerable to that of the apostle to the Thessalonians. And here he quotes scriptures: prove all things, hold fast to wit that which is good. But he received a vision, or a revelation from God. And to the pure, all things are pure, not only meats and drinks, but all kind of knowledge, whether of good or evil. The knowledge cannot defile, nor consequently the books, if the will and the conscience be not defiled. For books are, here is the famous passage again, for books are meats and viands, as meats and viands are, some of good, some of evil substance, and yet God in the unapocryphal vision said without exception, rise, Peter, kill and eat, leaving the choice to each man's discretion. Wholesome meats to a vitiated stomach differ little or nothing from unwholesome. So if you've got a bad stomach, it doesn't matter if you're eating good food. You're going to have a stomach ache. Is that a reason not to serve people good food? All people good food, or for that particular individual, I can't eat this? And best books to a naughty mind are not unapplicable to occasions of evil. So you can use the best text for an evil purpose if your will is evil, your intent is evil. Bad meats will scarce breed good nourishment in the healthiest concoction. But herein the difference is of bad books, that they to a discreet and judicious reader serve in many respects to discover, to confute, to forewarn, and to illustrate. Whereof, what better witness can we expect I should produce than one of your own now sitting in Parliament? The chief of learned men reputed in this land, Mr. Selden, whose volume of natural and national laws proves not only by great authorities brought together, but by exquisite reasons and theorems almost mathematically demonstrative, that all opinions, yea, errors, known, read, and collated, are of main service and assistance toward the speedy attainment of that which is truest. I conceive, therefore, that when God did enlarge the universal diet of man's body, referring to Peter, who won't eat of prohibited meats, that there's an extended meaning to that he has not prohibited any type of knowledge either. It's an extension of the same, but it's a hermeneutic principle that he's applying here. It's the same sort of argument. He doesn't cite Augustine here that Augustine makes in his On Christian Doctrine, where he's talking about Moses plundering the Egyptians' gold and their clothing and their silver and their utensils and taking them into the promised land and using what is good there for their purposes. But anyway, I'll get back to that when I talk about education. But he says that saving ever the rules of temperance, he then also, as before, left arbitrary, that is, to our will, the dieting and repasting of our minds, as wherein every mature man might have to exercise his own leading capacity. How great a virtue is temperance, how much of moment through the whole life of man? Yet God commits the managing so great a trust, without particular law or prescription, wholly to the demeanor of every grown man. It is no doubt a vast responsibility. And yet there is no law in Scripture or elsewhere that would exclude us from this high responsibility. And therefore, when he himself tabled the Jews from heaven, that omer, which was every man's daily portion of manna, is computed to have been more than might have well sufficed the heartiest feeder thrice as many meals. He gave us even more than we could ever eat. For those actions which enter into a man rather than issue out of him, and therefore defile not, God uses not to captivate under a perpetual childhood of prescription, but trusts him with the gift of reason to be his own chooser. There were but little work left for preaching. Here's a great argument to the Presbyterians and their men. There were but little work left for preaching if law and compulsion should grow so fast upon those things which heretofore were governed only by exhortation. Why would we even have preaching? What's the purpose of preaching? If you could compel the outcomes that you wanted. And of course you can't. So the condition of freedom is necessary, and the encouragement and the commendation of the will of God represented in the Word of God is our path here, etc. Solomon informs us that much reading is a weariness to the flesh, but neither he nor other inspired author tells us that such or such reading is unlawful. Yet certainly had God thought good to limit us herein, it had been much more expedient to have told us what was unlawful than what was wearisome. As for the burning of the Ephesian books by St. Paul's converts, 'tis replied the books were magic. The Syriac so renders them. They weren't any old books. They were magic, books of magic. That's what they burned. It was a private act, a voluntary act, and leads us to a voluntary imitation. We can choose to burn the books if we want. We don't want the government to do it for us. We don't want officialdom to do it for us. If you want to burn books and you want to burn more books than other people want books, you go and burn your own books. Don't command it as a public state act to do it, etc. So I don't want to go through the whole of it. I've given you a taste of it, and I think some of the fantastic quotations, I'm going to pluck a few of them out and just read them, and I'm going to do them at random and not go through this all, but I'll just read them to you because they're the ones that imprint themselves on your minds or your souls, and I think they're worthy of repeating. He says this: good and evil we know in the field of this world grow up together almost inseparably like the wheat and the tares. I added the wheat and the tares. I won't interrupt him again. They grow almost inseparably, and the knowledge of good is so involved and interwoven with the knowledge of evil, and in so many cunning resemblances hardly to be discerned, that those confused siege which were imposed upon psyche as an incessant labor to cull out and sort asunder were not more intermixed. It was from out the rind of one apple tasted that the knowledge of good and evil, as two twins cleaving together, leapt forth into the world. And perhaps this is that doom which Adam fell into of knowing good and evil. That is to say, of knowing good by evil. As therefore the state of man is, what wisdom can there be to choose? What continence to forbear without the knowledge of evil? He that can apprehend and consider vice with all her baits and seeming pleasures, and yet abstain, and yet distinguish, and yet prefer that which is truly better, he is the true wayfaring Christian. I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. Assuredly we bring not innocence into the world, we bring impurity, much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. Magnificent. A little further on. Seeing therefore that those books and those in great abundance which are likeliest to taint both life and doctrine cannot be suppressed without the fall of learning and of all ability in disputation, and that these books of either sort are most and soonest catching to the learned, from whom the common people, whatever is heretical or dissolute, may quickly be conveyed, and that evil manners are as perfectly learnt without books, 1,000 other ways which cannot be stopped, and evil doctrine not with books can propagate, except a teacher guide, which he might also do without writing, and so beyond prohibiting, I am not unable to unfold how this cautelous enterprise, this dangerous enterprise of licensing, can be exempted from the number of vain and impossible attempts. So this order of licensing conduces nothing to the end for which it is framed, and hath almost prevented me, by being clear already, with thus much hath been explaining. Pages on. They are not skillful considerers of human things who imagine to remove sin by removing the matter of sin. For besides that it is a huge heap increasing under the very act of diminishing, though some part of it may for a time be withdrawn from some persons, it cannot from all, in such a universal thing as books are. And when this is done, yet the sin remains entire. Though ye take from a covetous man all his treasure, he has yet one jewel left. Ye cannot bereave him of his covetousness. Banish all objects of lust, shut up all youth into the severest discipline that can be exercised in any hermitage. Ye cannot make them chaste that came not thither so. Such great care and wisdom is required to the great managing of this point. Suppose we could expel sin by this means, look how much we thus expel of sin, how much we expel of virtue. For the matter of them both is the same. Remove that and you remove them both alike. So you remove the sin, you're going to remove the virtue that combats it, because it's connected to it. The virtue rises up to slay the sin everywhere around. This justifies the high providence of God, who though he commands us temperance, justice, continence, yet pours out before us, even to a profuseness, all desirable things, and gives us minds that can wander beyond all limit and satiety. Why should we then affect a rigor contrary to the manner of God and of nature, by abridging or scanting those means which books freely permitted are, both to the trial of virtue and the exercise of truth? It would be better done to learn that the law must needs be frivolous, which goes to restrain things uncertainly, and yet equally working to good and to evil. And were I a chooser, a dram of well-doing should be preferred before many times as much the forcible hindrance of evil doing. Pages on. When a man writes to the world, he summons up all his reason and deliberation to assist him. He searches, meditates, is industrious, and likely consults and confers with his judicious friends. After all of which done, he takes himself to be informed in what he writes, as well as any that writ before him. If in this the most consummate act of his fidelity and ripeness, no years, no industry, no former proof of his abilities can bring him to that state of maturity as not to be still mistrusted and suspected, unless he carry all his considerate diligence, all his midnight watchings, and expense of Palladian oil to the hasty view of his unleisured licenser. Perhaps much his younger, perhaps far his inferior in judgment, perhaps one who never knew the labor of book writing, and if he be not repulsed or slighted, must appear in print like a puny with his guardian, and in his censor's hand on the back of his title to be his bail and surety. That he is no idiot or seducer, it cannot be but a dishonor and derogation to the author, to the book, to the privilege and dignity of learning. So John Milton's like, how dare you license me? Who are you to license me? How do you, young man, know how to license? To understand what I've read, like your spirit is not sufficient to have done this. There's a little bit of arrogance on the part. On the other hand, there's a voice of wisdom in this. How can those who have not yet obtained the wisdom of years have the maturity and the wisdom to discern what is wise in others? It's a terrific form of argument. It goes on and on and on. I can't present all of this. But again, this encomium to truth. Truth is compared in Scripture to a streaming fountain. If her waters flow not in a perpetual progression, they sicken into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. A man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believe things only because his pastor says so, or the assembly so determines, without knowing other reason, though his belief be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. There is not any burden that some would gladlier post off to another than the charge and care of their religion. It's a evasion of responsibility. It's the pastor's responsibility for my soul. It's the church councils. It's the Christian universities. I'm not responsible for my own soul. There be who knows not that there be of Protestants and professors who live and die in as errant and implicit faith as any lay papist of Loreto. How about that? Milton knows how to win friends. Since he's a Puritan, He's speaking to his audience. His audience is puritanical in their own fervor. He knows that you can feign true religion and yet be false. A wealthy man addicted to his pleasure and to his profits find religion to be a traffic so entangled and of so many piddling accounts that of all mysteries he cannot skill to keep its stock going upon that trade. What should he do? Fain he would have the name to be religious. Fain he would bear up with his neighbors in that. What does he therefore? But resolves to give over toiling and to find himself out some factor, that is, some individual to whose care and credit he may commit the whole managing of his religious affairs. I'll appoint, I'll have a pastor in my own house, and he will show that I'm a religious man, but his own heart is unreformed. Anyway, I think I'm done with this because I can go on for the whole 3 hours, and it's such a long work with such vigor to it and such splendor. But I've already outlined the character of the argument and given you enough of a taste of it for you to appreciate, and I'll stop there for now.